theme and outline our program for today, and then step aside for our experts and our storytellers to share their wisdom with us. But first, I wanted to just do a quick bit of housekeeping. The slides that we're going to see later today, as well as a link to the recording of today's talk and a tip sheet that outlines a lot of what we'll be going over today, will be sent to you via email afterward, as well as an invitation to a follow-up webinar that we're going to have the week after next. So we're going to have time for Q&A at the end, and in order to register questions, please use the chat box and the Q&A box. Everybody's going to be muted throughout so that we don't hear each other's children talking and dogs barking and sirens and all the things of that nature. So we're going to begin now, but before we dive in, I just wanted to hold a moment of silence for Breonna Taylor, and then we'll begin. Thank you for that moment of mourning and prayer. Today, Faith in Public Life is holding this conversation with Over Zero because the United States does sit at a dangerous moment. I don't want to sugarcoat it. There is a threat of political violence in the run-up to the election, as well as in its aftermath. We see many warning signs of this that we'll discuss today. A couple that come to mind are the glorification of the Kenosha protest killer, Kyle Rittenhouse, a lot of disinformation and misinformation about stolen ballots and the election being rigged and things of that nature, misrepresentation of protests, the emergence of militia groups. These are all dangerous trends, and I think we all recognize that, and that's why 300 people registered to join us today. And political violence is really nothing new in this country. The United States is a revolutionary country after all, and there's a long legacy of lynching of voter registration workers and people who tried to vote, intimidation at the polls, assassinations. Those are all part of the American story. But today we're not here just to sound the alarm. We're here to prepare as well, because we know from experience and from history that faith communities and people of faith can be violence preventers and peacekeepers and peace builders. We can respond effectively when violence breaks out, and we can use messaging that'll help it so that it doesn't happen in the first place. So we want to talk today a lot about that messaging. And the first step before we learn any talking points is to be prepared. By being here today, you're beginning the work of being a voice for peace and a messenger for peace by learning what goes into it. Now we have 3 segments of today's discussion that I'll tee up and then kick off. But first, we're going to have Faith in Public Life's Ohio Director, Reverend Dan Clark, as well as Imam Horseed Noah, who's a member of Faith in Life's board and the leader of one of the largest Somali American mosque in Columbus, Ohio. They're part of a really robust interfaith movement in Central Ohio that's networking and organizing and taking action together to really walk the walk of peace and to have their messaging as well as the way they're building relationships lay that groundwork. Then we're going to have Rachel Brown and Samantha Owens from Over Zero, who are going to talk about some specific messages as well as do's and don'ts and best practices and action steps that you can take home locally and put to use. Now, Rachel and Sam, we've been working with them at Faith in Public Life since the summer of 2017. Actually, our first event together was 3 days after the white supremacist attack in Charlottesville. And I really feel that that was providential that we started that work together at that time. And we've been working together in many states, and as well as in dialogues like this ever since. They are top of the field experts. And as a matter of fact, Dan and Horsed's story that they're going to be sharing today about their own work in Columbus, Ohio, is really rooted in many ways in the lessons and messaging that Rachel and Sam have been training people on for many years. So, and then finally, after we've heard from everyone I've just named, we are going to have Q&A. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box as we go. My colleague, Kelsey Herbert, and I will be keeping an eye on that. We might inject a couple of questions during the presentations, but we are going to be holding the bulk of them for the end. And with that, I will just remind us one more time that this is being recorded, and the slides and the recording and some tip sheets will be sent to you after this is all over. And with that, I'll turn it over to Horsed and Dan. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan. Again, my name is Reverend Dan Clark. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the Ohio Director at Faith in Public Life. And I want to set up briefly a story of something we experienced about 1.5 years ago. It was a couple days before during Ramadan in 2018, when I heard from a clergy partner in our network who was very involved in reproductive justice work. He would show up to provide safety to people going to clinics and such. And he reached out to me and told me that Coach Dave and the Salt and Light Brigade were planning to disrupt peaceful prayer at a mosque in Columbus on Eid. He learned this because Coach Dave and the Salt and Light Brigade did this often at women's health clinics and abortion clinics, and they had learned that and thought that perhaps Faith in Public Life's network and the Muslim members in our network might need to know this. And so, you know, Coach Dave and the Salt and Light Brigade is tracked as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and based right here in Central Ohio. It's predominantly a video blogger who preaches messages of hate and cloaks them in kind of Christian vocabulary. So when I heard from this clergy person about Coach Dave targeting a mosque in Columbus at Eid, I reached out first to my brother Horsed and asked him how we might gather together to be sure that Muslims going to pray at Eid would be safe and supported. So we immediately moved toward coordinating with the mosque's leadership, and they welcomed our presence there. And so we began to put out the word across our network, and inviting anyone to come on that Friday to be a peaceful witness to love. A barrier for love is how we talked about it, so that we could create a safe space for people going to the mosque. I will say the day came with a lot of challenges, a lot of logistical challenges. Coach Dave didn't want to announce which mosque they were going to target. And so we actually had to send people in our network to a couple different mosques and make some guesses based on what we were pulling from his video blogs on which one it might be. But at the end of all that strategy and logistical maneuvering, we were able to have over 200 people at the Omar Mosque, very near to Ohio State University's campus. Over 200 people were there to witness to love, when about a dozen people showed up with Coach Dave and the Salt and Light Brigade. And so, as I told my kids when I got home that night, if it was a game of dodgeball, we definitely would have won. There were over 200 people witnessing to love when a dozen people showed up with Coach Dave. We focused on just being present and mostly on being silent. There were times when we would sing simple songs, interfaith songs, songs of love, but mostly we were just there, present and silent, so that people walking to the mosque could do so safely and peacefully. At the end of the day, our diverse and peaceful witness to love silenced the hate, and Coach Dave and his brigade did not stay as long as they planned to across the street from Omar Mosque. And so now I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, Imam Horsed, to share his perspectives on that day. Horsed?
Thank you, Brother Dan. Can everybody hear me? And thank you. I want to thank first and foremost the organizers of this amazing webinar. I just want to sort of contextualize what my colleague and dear friend Dan just said. I want all of you to know that this day was our biggest holiday of the year. If you can imagine, you've been waiting this holiday, this religious festival all year, and you just finished fasting an entire month. So this is when families and friends and colleagues of the Muslim community come together and they express their love. This is when we worship God. So when Brother Dan called me and I came to know about this hate group, the first thing that came to my mind was, what would be the impression of my nephews and family members? Because half of my family members, they go to that mosque, Omar Mosque. So I was like, oh God, I hope that they don't disturb our festival, because we were there to worship God and express our love and gratitude. So what really amazed me is not only how quick we were able to organize ourselves and come together, but also how we outnumbered them. Imagine the bearers of the banner of love immediately came together and outnumbered this hate group. That is really what impressed me so much. And God is my witness. At the end of that day, a group of us came together and we were talking about how it felt. So if you can imagine, the day before that, we were so worried. We were like, I hope our kids don't see, the Muslim children don't see this hate group. The first day they want to celebrate their Eid, it's called Eid. But what they have seen was people with love who came to give them a moral support, who came to tell them that not only we are here to protect you from this hate group, but we're here also to show you that we are in solidarity with you. So at the end of that day, the imams of the Muslim community came together and we expressed really our love. And we have seen how love can always defeat hate. What I want to say is, those of us who are holding the banner of love have an immense responsibility. What we are doing is the role of the messengers of God. What we're doing is what our scriptures command us. And we have shared with our congregation what happened and how people of love will always outnumber than any hate group. So it was really beautiful. At the end of the day, we have seen that love can always defeat hate, and we have a job to do. And as a Muslim, as an imam, this is my message always to our congregation, that one of the names of God is Al-Wadud in the Arabic language, which means the God of love, the loving God. So it was a beautiful day. And I think we have immense responsibility to come together, organize ourselves on a common platform, and promote and spread the message of love and tolerance and compassion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imam Horsed, and it's good to see your face. It's been a while. And Dan, thank you as well for setting the stage. Glad that you two were both here to share that story, because for the folks who are tuning in for the first time today, a lot of preparation went into this, a lot of very careful messaging. And it's not so much about knowing a magic word and a zinger of a message. It's about knowing the kind of tone that we need to take, and the broad, simple, inclusive, peace priming messages that we use. It's kind of simple, really, but there's a lot of do's and a lot of don'ts, a lot of lessons of experience that our next speakers, Samantha Owens and Rachel Brown, are going to share with us. And as I said before, these two are top of the field experts in teaching folks like us to use the kind of messaging and the kind of organizing tactics that will prevent incidents like that Coach Dave really rhetorical attack from escalating out of control and becoming the new normal. So with that, I will turn it over to Samantha Owens and Rachel Brown from Over0. Thank you all so much for coming today.
Thank you, and I will just say thank you to Faith in Public Life for hosting this, to everyone who's attending, and it's always such an honor and delight to work with the Faith in Public Life team, and Herset, to see you and be with you again. My name is Rachel Brown. I'm the Executive Director of Over0. We're an organization that's committed to preventing and creating long-term societal resilience to identity-based violence and other forms of group-targeted harm. Before diving into some of our content that we have for you today, I want to let my colleague Samantha Owens introduce herself quickly.
Hi, everyone. I'm Samantha Owens. I am the U.S. Regional Director for Over0. And just to echo what Rachel just said, it's really wonderful to be here with you all. Faith in Public Life programming is always such a wonderful experience. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon, whether it's late afternoon or early afternoon for you, depending on where you are. We really appreciate you being here with us today.
Great. So we have a presentation for you today that really goes through some of the do's and don'ts when it comes to rapid response messaging. And as we talk through it, we'll also talk about how proactive action and proactive messaging and narrative setting can help build the foundation on which this rapid response action, these rapid response messages can work. But just briefly before going into that, Dan and I felt really at the beginning of this queued up that we do face a moment of great risk. And for us at Over0, our focus is really on the power of communication as a tool to lead societies towards division, to garner support, and mobilize people to think that violence is okay, to target different groups with violence, or accept even human and civil rights abuses against different groups in society. And we started work in the US when we started to see this really clear pattern of speech that we're so familiar with as a really early warning flag and indicator of risk of violence start to emerge here in the US. Demonization of different groups, portrayal of entire groups of people as threats, scapegoating, dehumanizing narratives, and messaging that portrays violence or abuses as the only option, the only way to quote unquote protect our group, often protect our women and children is the narrative that gets used, appeals to these certain versions of masculinity, this destruction of alternatives to violence, and sort of releasing people from moral obligations that might otherwise keep them on a different track, and real valorization of violence in the face of that. And so this is why we've been working with Faith in Public Life for so long, and why it's been so important for us to do so, because when we see these risk factors emerge around the world, as we have here, faith leaders play a really key role. And it's not only in the messages that they give, it's who they are as messengers. And I think this is something, I just want to ground the discussion today in this note that when we talk about communication, we're talking not just about the words that are used, we're talking about signals that get sent, we're talking about imagery, photographs that appear in the media and start to tell a story of who we are and what's going on in our society. We're talking about not just the message, but the messenger. Are there important peace-promoting messages coming from leaders that people trust and guidance in their lives? And are these messages having reach? And so you heard a lot from the story from Herset and from Dan about what it looked like in the face of a group that was mobilizing on the lines of these dangerous narratives, this Coach Dave, this hate group, mobilizing to actually physically prevent people from engaging in prayer on a really important day, and how quickly they were able to mobilize in the face of logistical challenges and to get 200 people to show up with this proactive and beautiful message that was able to really clearly steer the day in a different direction away from hate, and even fortify and reinforce these relationships between leaders from different faiths. That, of course, takes work that starts now. It takes those relationships already being in place. It mattered that those different faith leaders had relationships with each other, had a way to mobilize, had already thought through messages. So Sam will talk at the end of this training about the second of these trainings that we have with Faith in Public Life coming up, that's really about preparing that infrastructure. But today we want to start by teeing up, once there is that infrastructure, what are the types of messages that it can send? And so we are going to go through some do's and don'ts of rapid response messaging. This is your preview slide, so I'm not going to stay on it for too long, but you can see that there are several really key and important do's and don'ts to be aware of. And we talk about do's and don'ts. The do's are really about what are the types of messages? What's the type of communication that can help people understand what's going on around them and guide them to take, A, not to participate in violence or in hateful rhetoric or in actions that fuel the risk of violence, but also B, to actually take positive, proactive engagement, to do things like showing up outside the mosque at Eid. And so when we talk about the don'ts, we're talking about approaches that can feel and seem intuitive, but that can sometimes backfire and actually unintentionally lead to further harm. So we're going to jump right in here with the do's. The first thing to remember is that where different communities are targeted with violence, the absolute first thing to do before acting is to consult with those communities. And I want to go back to Horset and Dan's example. When Dan learned that there was this planned protest, or if you can even call it that, right? That there was this planned violent mobilization to show up at a mosque, his first step was to say, who do I know that's part of this community that's going to be affected? Let me talk to them and see what can work. This is really, really important, that the people who are most impacted or most likely to be impacted by violence have a say in what happens and in what these preventative actions are, because you never know, somebody might flag, actually, if a lot of people show up at the mosque, this might be the downside to it. We'd actually like it if it would be more important if you stood on that side of the street, or if you do it this way, it might interfere with people coming, right? I think really being able to listen to people's preferences and start with those conversations. And so an important first step that you can start to prepare yourself to be able to do that with rapid response is actually starting building those relationships right now. And where you have those relationships, just making sure you know where you have them, where the gaps are, and that you're starting conversations to say, you know, I want you to know that whatever happens in our community, I want us to be able to show up for each other, and getting to that level of comfort where you're able to pick up the phone and say, hey, this is going on, let's coordinate together. That really matters. A really important priority in the face of violence or mobilization towards violence, or sort of narratives starting to take hold that are fueling violence in a community, is to set and model positive norms. We talked about how often violence can be used to intimidate, to threaten different groups. One of the things that happens in the narratives that I told you about is that they remove this sense of moral agency, this idea that we have no other choice but violence, and that violence is absolutely what's expected of people in a particular community, and that it's acceptable. And it's very important to ensure that that is not allowed to stand. One of the things we know about people's behavior is that people tend to act based on what they think all or most of their peers, of the sort of people like them, are doing. And so this is even subconscious, but I always like to think about this as like a clique in a high school cafeteria, right? Kids in a high school cafeteria, they want to do what their friends are doing. They want to fit in, and they're constantly aware of and taking note of what are people wearing, how are the trends shifting. Unfortunately, this is kind of how we operate well into adulthood and old age, is that we're incredibly influenced by what we think is acceptable, but what we think are sort of these informal rules of how we're supposed to behave, and what we think other people will approve or disapprove of. And so it's really important in the face of violence, especially where there's media coverage of groups that are spreading this sort of hateful and dangerous rhetoric. It's really important to emphasize in the face of that, unifying identities and relevant narratives that promote really protecting dignity. And so setting these positive norms is absolutely essential. So coming out and messaging with a message that talks about we. This is what we do. As faith leaders, we show up for each other. This is what we're doing. Look how many people have shown up at this mosque. That message of love, and making sure that message that this is what the norm is. There is being able to talk about how problematic an act of violence is, or a certain type of rhetoric is, while also proactively setting this norm about support for people's rights and dignity. You can really use we framing here to bring people along and emphasize a commitment to positive actions, right? And to the importance of taking action across dividing lines. And this can be in the messaging that you put out to the public, but it's also important. We always say this: show, don't tell. Don't just tell. So you can say, we're committed to acting together. You can say, it's important to support the dignity of people. But think about the emotional impact of someone just saying that versus a story of, this is what I did that showed my commitment, right? Even as a leader, sharing a story, sharing what happened that really demonstrates that commitment, or demonstrates how suddenly, and then more people got involved. And now we were there with this boundary of love, and I realized how many people support this and just how important it is to our community. And in a given moment, in that rapid response moment, to go back to this example from Ohio, there was a strong message sent by standing there in silence, right? In silence. That's an image, that's a signal, that's a form of communication. By singing songs together, right? That's not just saying, hey, we're taking action across different lines and we're committed to this. That's really showing up in solidarity. And if you think about the news story that goes along with it, it tells a story that actually demonstrates real action and commitment. Those songs actually show people coming together across dividing lines. So this show don't tell is really important when it comes to not just talking about and emphasizing those positive norms, but actually, actually living them. Let's see if I can get this to play again. Another important thing is that in times of uncertainty, which is often the case if there's confusion, if there's any level of chaos or conflict, when there's a level of uncertainty, people tend to gravitate towards leaders that say, this is who we are, rather than this is who we aren't. And so really thinking about the messaging that you're putting out there, instead of getting drawn into messaging about this is violence, this is what's happening here, saying this is who we are. We believe that our neighbors have a right to pray. We support that, and they support us too, right? So this is who we are. This goes to that norm setting, but it also starts to set a positive, inclusive definition of how someone can belong and be part of this broader group, because we really care about belonging. So providing this sense of belonging with this is who we are in response to a crisis moment can also be a really important way to cut through the noise and bring people on board for positive action. Also, grounding in values. This is so important at a moment where often people are being told, you have no other choice but violence. We have no other choice but to engage in these harmful ways, or to just disengage. It's too hard. Nothing we do will make a difference, right? Grounding in values that says no matter what's happening around us, we're committed to these values. And faith leaders, we see this around the world, that even in really contentious times, faith leaders are able to orient people towards their faith, towards their values, and restore a sense of agency, of I can do something. We can do something together, even in moments where people are feeling pressure to not act or to act in harmful ways. So telling people who we are and grounding that in values, a really important thing to do in a moment of rapid response. And this comes to, I wanted to emphasize this a second time, really emphasizing that sense of agency. And again, faith leaders so well placed to do this and to model a sense of agency, and we have, and ground that agency in values, showing people that they have a choice, providing people with actions that they can take in a given moment to show their support for this more positive action. It's also really important to model and showcase empathy, especially where there has been violence or there has been harm. And I would say that a threat of violence causes harm, right? The fact that anyone had to wake up and worry, are my nieces and nephews, is my family going to show up today for this important celebration? And are they going to see this protest, right? Even like that is a harm, right? So when people are experiencing being targeted with violence, when there is violence, when there are harms, modeling and showing empathy is really important as a leader. And one of the things that we know about empathy is actually that it's sometimes harder for people to feel empathy for a group that they don't see themselves as being part of, right? When they don't see someone as being part of their group or their community, the automatic processes, even in our brains, that connect and feed empathy can be less active. However, one of the things that can help overcome that division of empathy, where we can feel more empathy for people we see as part of our community than we do for others, is by having leaders model empathy and talk about their own feelings of empathy. This has to do with setting those norms, showing that empathy is actually who we are, and it has to do with creating an opening for people through your experience to start to think about how someone else might feel. It's really important to do this towards communities targeted with violence. So when I saw this happen, it broke my heart to see that somebody wasn't going to be able to pray, or might be blocked from making it into their place of worship. I imagined what I would feel like if that happened to me, and I felt so compelled to do something about it. So really talking through your own process of empathy to bring people along, and also not just leaving it at empathy. I really felt for that person or for that community, but taking it to the next level. I felt empathy, and even though I had a really busy day, or even though it felt really uncomfortable to show up there, or whatever the barrier might be for someone to showing up, I went because the way I felt made it feel so important to show up in this way. And it felt like once I understood this perspective, once I had this feeling, there was no way not to act. So tying empathy to action, talking through your process of empathy and how it led to action can help bring people along on that journey, especially again in these rapid response moments, saying, I'm seeing this is how it's making me feel, and therefore I'm taking this action. It's also important to model empathy and show empathy to the audience you're speaking to. So if you're trying to bring a congregation along with you as a faith leader, or if you're any type of leader trying to bring people along, starting to identify what are the things that might be causing them to say there's nothing I can do? What might be leading to a sense of hopelessness or a lack of agency? Or if I say something, my peers might tell me I'm not, following what they hope. I'm not enough with my political party. I'm not enough, whatever it might be. I might sort of get negative feedback from my peers, right? Whatever it might be, that you can put yourself in your audience's shoes and say, what might be preventing them from taking action right now? What might be leading them towards acquiescence or even towards harmful behavior? Exercising that empathy can also help you find messaging that will resonate, or actions that can resonate to bring people along in that moment. So we've talked a lot about different communities being targeted with violence. Sometimes, and I think with a lot of the dynamics that we're seeing here around protests and everything like that, we are seeing people really, we're seeing a lot of different emotions related to very real, very long-term grievances. And we're seeing some incidents of specific people becoming violent in the midst of this. It's really important that broad calls for peace, especially if you're responding to something like that, offer a really clear, concrete path for addressing grievances. So something we can often see that's a misstep in violence prevention messaging internationally is messaging that just kind of tells people to accept the status quo. Be peaceful. It'll all be okay, right? And I think it's really important to remember that where there are grievances, where there's long-term structural violence, and then when we see instances of violence emerge amidst that the messaging does not tell people you shouldn't have a grievance, but it instead helps provide different options for how to engage and the different ways, and elevates, and this can be really important where groups of people are being portrayed as violence, elevates the stories of the positive ways that people are engaging in that moment, specifically to address grievances. It's really important that where there is violence or related events, to be very, very careful and specific when sharing information. It's really important to remember that violence and stories about violence can be used as a tool for intimidation. This is especially true around elections, where we might see violent actors show up at polling stations or things like that. there's an immediate intimidation through that violence, but also once it gets picked up as a story and spread around, this can serve as a tool. This can fuel intimidation for a much broader segment of society as these stories spread. And so where violence is being used to dissuade people from exercising their civic rights, from protesting or from voting or whatever it might be, where it's being used as a tool of intimidation, it's really important in the messaging that addresses it not to portray it as bigger than it is, as more extensive than it is, and to really, when talking about that violence, talk about it in very clear, specific ways, exactly what happened, but also exactly what was done to address it. Right? We talked a lot about positive framing, and this should be the orientation for rapid response messaging, but where you need to reference specific instances of violence, it's really important not to use this alarmist, sensationalist language. Sam will talk about this later, but instead to be clear and specific, to provide context of everything else that's going on as well. And we had hundreds of faith leaders show up at polling stations with signs to thank people for voting, to help make sure everyone felt safe going to the polling station, right? And really leading with that positive messaging so that you don't accidentally provide a platform for that violence to continue to fuel intimidation. And part of doing this is to listen to communities that are being targeted first. To what level is intimidation being felt? To what level do they think it's helpful or harmful to talk about violence? And then it's also important to remember that sometimes language can fuel unequal treatment or stereotypes of groups. So we see this a lot with protests, where we see language that says like a protest erupted into violence. And maybe what happened is that a couple of protesters were violent, and then also a group of police officers fired tear gas on protesters. And the scene that erupts, the scene that quote unquote erupts looks chaotic, right? But using the language that violence erupts at a protest, there's chaos, is very unclear, first of all, about who's involved. It implies that it's just protesters. It uses a metaphor of eruption, which is totally out of control and totally chaotic, and again, can relate back to this idea of protesters more broadly, and can fuel different stereotypes. And it's really evident, I think something to look at is how violence that has happened at protests by individual protesters and by police officers has been framed and portrayed as this broad sense of protest violence, but then also specifically how, if we look at sort of armed protests, for example, at the Michigan State Legislature, was that framed in the same terms of eruption and chaos, right? So looking at how different groups are discussed differently in relation to violence can help us see how underlying stereotypes get fueled, even in the language that just gets used to describe what's happening, and be careful not to fuel that. It's really important to ensure that in everything you do not dehumanize. And this means being really careful with specific words and imagery, including victimizing language, portraying groups of people as solely victims, not having agency, or sort of, using really victimizing language that doesn't tell the full story of people. And I think that where well-intentioned messaging can sometimes do this is in wanting to show how horrible bad events are. And we've actually seen with like a lot of human rights messaging, it can actually fuel dehumanization by showing just images and images of people being treated in dehumanizing ways, which starts to fuel different associations. And so it's really important to be careful with words and imagery, especially when you're talking about or sharing stories that involve groups that have been targeted with dehumanizing language and with violence. Often when groups are dehumanized, they're portrayed as either lacking warmth or lacking competence. So the idea that a group of people is cold and intends badly towards our group, quote unquote, or is completely incompetent, right? So when you think about it, we tend to think of groups we're part of as being warm and competent, well-intending towards the greater good, and also with some degree of competency. Groups are typically stereotyped. We often see, for example, people experiencing homelessness portrayed as having low warmth and low competency, kind of dangerous, and it evokes this real this reaction of disgust when we see that type of dehumanizing language targeting different groups. We see in common anti-Semitic tropes, Jews are portrayed as being highly competent, manipulative, part of these global conspiracies, but also very cold. So we can think about the different ways that groups are dehumanized. And specifically, when you are sharing stories or images that talk about any group that's already been targeted in your community, it's really important that you tell stories that show both warmth and competence that exists, rather than only focusing on one or the other. So that accidental dehumanizing narrative often portrays groups as being really low competency or having a low level of agency. And here is where you can think about the structures that you build too, right? Are you just telling stories, or have you built connections? Are you actually helping people hear directly from different groups and different communities? Undermine biases that emerge in conflict. These are a few large words that I'll describe a bit. One is called motive attribution asymmetry. There's this tendency. Let me back up for a second. I want you all to pretend that you're driving on the highway and somebody suddenly cuts you off. Okay, Dan's acting this out. Somebody cuts you off. And you're like, where does your mind go about why they cut you off, right? Where is your automatic reaction? It's like, they're such a jerk. Why did they do that? I can't believe they would do that to me. It's so inconsiderate. Now take a second and imagine that you're the one driving down the highway. And suddenly somebody honks and you realize that you cut them off. And you're like, gosh, don't be so angry at me. I was in a hurry. I'm trying to get to pick up my kid, or my kids are fighting in the back seat and I'm kind of distracted, or I was lost, or whatever it might be. So we have these like fundamental biases that exist all the time in our brains, where we sort of attribute different motivations to ourselves or others when we're sort of observing people in the world. And when groups come into conflict with each other, there's this research that shows that people tend to say, well, my group, we might be doing these violent or bad things, but we're doing it out of love. We just love and want to protect the people in our group. But when they do it, they're acting out of hate. They're doing it because they hate us. And this is consistent across groups. Like, both groups in a conflict will say, we're acting out of love, they're acting out of hate. What's important here is that there's an asymmetry. Neither of those is right. There's no group that is entirely acting out of love and no group that is entirely acting out of hate. People have all different motives, right? Especially when you're talking about entire groups of people in a conflict. But that asymmetry portrays the other group as completely not understandable, right? And so I think it's really important to be aware of this when a conflict might be escalating in your community, especially around things like election results or something like that. The other thing is meta perceptions. This is a really powerful narrative that fuels violence and fuels conflict. It says they hate us, right? They think we are less than human. That's a narrative that really evokes a sense of threat and that leads us to do the same in return. In general, if we think that group dehumanizes us, we dehumanize that group in return. And it leads to this cycle where we get pitted further and further into groups and feel more justified in dehumanizing or buying into narratives of hate about another group because we think they feel that way about us. It can be really important where there's opportunities to undermine some of those narratives, to come together across different dividing lines, maybe that's political lines or whatever else, and to show actions that undermine different negative meta perceptions, the perceptions of what they think of us. It can be a really powerful tool to help undermine conflict. So there might be some rapid response scenarios where this is an appropriate type of messaging to show, look, we're showing up for them and they're showing up for us, right? You're starting to bring things on a different trajectory. We're not going to go through all of the best practices for correcting mis and disinformation right this second. There are a lot of them. You'll get access to them in some sort of handout. We have them in the toolkit that we're producing. I think we've presented to different faith and public life groups a bunch, but I'll talk about a couple of these things right now that I think are sort of the most common intuitive ways to correct mis and disinformation that can backfire. And this is really important when you're in rapid response mode, because often you're responding to rumors. You're responding to rumors that fuel these dangerous narratives, and you're trying to give people accurate information. One of the most common mistakes in correcting misinformation is repeating it. The more we hear information, the more it feels familiar and correct to us, even at a subconscious level. And so it biases us in how we interpret new information and take it in or don't. And so it's really important that if you have to repeat a piece of misinformation, start by telling people that it's wrong. People are really making false claims. This is the true thing that's happening, but people are falsely saying this other thing is happening. So you're priming people to already not take in that misinformation and include it in the sort of filter for how they're going to see the world going forward. It's also really important to use positive framing. I always use the example of, if Dan had introduced me and said, this is Rachel, she's terrible, she's a thief, beware of her. And then Sam came, my colleague, and said, no, don't be terrified of Rachel. She's not horrible. She's not a thief. Rachel's not a thief. Rachel's not a thief. What you'll remember after this webinar, maybe you still will, so I'm sorry I shouldn't do this to myself, but you might remember this association between Rachel and thief. And this is what happens often when we correct misinformation, right? This person is not this. This group is not like this. Whereas we're strengthening the association between those two things. Instead, you can use positive framing. Rachel is so wonderful and generous and giving of everything that she has, right? So you use the positive framing, and this is the case when you're correcting misinformation about different groups. This is the case when you're correcting misinformation about what might be going on in your community. Talk about what is, use the positive framing, and if you need to flag what's incorrect, talk about it as being incorrect first and tell people to beware before you do. Always analyze for risk. This is something that I can't tell you exactly what's going to be the risk in your context. And we've talked about really broad rapid response considerations that you might deploy across a whole different range of things that might be going on. Are there clashes between protesters supporting different parties? Is a group being targeted with hate violence, right? Which of these types of responses is going to be appropriate is dependent on your analysis of what's going on. These are just a range of things to choose from and think about as you do rapid response. But you should also consider your specific context when it comes for risk, right? It's really critical that every time we're responding in some way, we can ask, could we make things worse, right? If we put out a message, if we do something right now, could it fuel confusion? Could our messaging that we're putting out there make people feel more like they don't understand what's going on because we've given too many different types of information and we've overwhelmed them? Could it fuel a sense of defeatism, right? Sometimes like there's nothing I can do, a sense of chaos. If so, it could contribute to harm, this sort of broader harmful environment that becomes more permissive of violence. And this is, of course, if it could fuel any sort of these dangerous, harmful narratives that we've talked about a little bit today. Ask yourself, could a message undermine or harm a group that's already been targeted with violence? If so, it probably will contribute to harm, right? So is there initiative that's being taken by a group that has been targeted by violence, and your message might take away the spotlight from them, right? I think that this should be mitigated by that first step, which is listening to communities first, but always asking yourself whether anything that you're doing could cause harm in any ways, and just asking, like, is there any way that us putting this out there could bring more attention to violence, to negative actors and ideologies, could make violence seem more prevalent than it actually is. And just a consideration of this and a brainstorm with a couple of people in your network. This is where having those relationships matter. People that might have different lenses to seeing risk can be a really good check before you do something. The final thing, and this is something that we'll get into a little bit more on the next one of these, but is anticipating and preparing, right? There's a lot of messaging that needs to be done in real time, responsive to different ongoing dynamics. But there's also things that you can anticipate. By spending a little time thinking about what are the risks or different scenarios that might happen in our community, mapping out, okay, there's these different types of potential tensions, violence, escalation of risk, you can start to prepare messaging that might be really specific, right? Maybe it's about voter intimidation. Maybe it has to do with people showing up armed to protest. Whatever it might be for your particular community, you can start to think about, well, which of these types of messaging would be most appropriate, or is there something different? What are our community values that we can really anchor ourselves in and start messaging on in advance? And you can think about, especially right now with the election cycle, things like there's a waiting period. How are we going to talk people through that waiting period and keep them calm? Can we be ready Don't start talking about it now necessarily. Can we be ready to tell people we're staying, we're waiting, we're keeping calm to make sure that our communities, all the votes in our community and every other community get to be counted. So do this thinking in advance. Don't start talking publicly about all the worst case scenarios, because that can cause a sense of alarmism. But do that work with your network to start saying, maybe there's some messages we can prepare in advance. And then when we're responding, they might not be perfect, but we have something to start with. So I know we're telling you a lot. Like Dan said, there will be handouts, but I'll hand it over to Samantha now. Or don't. Oh, and this is, I guess, the last sort of transition here, which is what I was just saying, is be careful how you discuss risks internally with your networks, but also in terms of external messaging, because it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy to start telling people, and this can go wrong and that can go wrong. This is really for your internal planning to be able to be prepared.
Great. So thank you, Rachel. I will be talking about some of the don'ts. Before I go into that, I just wanted to flag what I see in the chat in terms of, these positive approaches. And are we turning a blind eye and ignoring the underlying dangers and dynamics at play? And I think it's a really good point to bring up the importance of being tactical and being organized. And that is really what we will be talking about on the next webinar. So the idea of this is first to get everybody, give more tools for messaging in the immediate. Rapid response messaging, do's and don'ts, how to set positive norms, and if nothing else, how to not accidentally make things worse with well-intentioned messaging. But this obviously isn't the full piece of the puzzle, right? The full piece of the puzzle is so many different approaches, from, potential organizing capacities to, communication infrastructure, to relationships, to mapping out which resources your network has. And that is really what we will be touching on next time. So I just want to say that I noted people's concerns, and they're completely valid. And what we're absolutely not saying is ignore the mobilization of militias and other violent actors and just put out positive messages that gloss over what's happening. What we're saying is these are best practices in the face of rising tensions that accompany the really deep mobilization infrastructures that are needed, similar to what Dan and Horst shared.
Maybe just to add on that positive framing, and to go back to the example that Dan and Horst gave. I hadn't gotten to see the chat, or I might have addressed it as going on. It's not to say everything is great. In the face of that mobilization, for example, of Coach Dave, they were able to mobilize a large group of faith leaders. Again, that is a lot of building organizing capacity. And this messaging, like I said, should go along with action, show, not just tell. But if the messaging is militias are bad, we all hate militias, it draws more attention to militias and can actually build more of a platform for those militias to be able to intimidate more people, spread their message further. So it's important to recognize the danger, but to say, in the face of a threat from militias, who we are as faith leaders is people committed to these values. We're committed to our neighbors, and therefore we're showing up, right? This is how you mobilize people to positive action. We're showing up, or we're opening our church for sanctuary because these are our core values and who we are, even in the face of these different risks. So really grounding it in a way that brings more people on board, because a lot of the tactics of these groups are to bring more attention to themselves, to be able to intimidate, to silence, to drive people to acquiescence. And so it's really important in the face to mobilize that in the people in the face of that, and to ensure that that type of violence and rhetoric isn't able to sort of become the norm and be used to silence and intimidate others. Being able to mobilize people and show them that in the face of this intimidation, in the face of this violence, people of faith are doing this. This is what our norm is as people of faith. We're not staying silent. We're not doing nothing. We're not going along with it and glorifying or saying, that the violence that's happening, you know, someone showing up at a protest and shooting someone, we're not going to say that that's okay. And actually, instead, we are going to use our voices to say that is not, absolutely not okay. And instead, what we're going to do is show up and offer sanctuary to people. We're going to show up and use our voices in this positive way. I hope that helps address.
Yeah. And I see another question in the chat that I'm just going to put a pin in about, you know, instilling a sense of urgency without being alarmist, which is obviously a very fine line. And I think something a lot of people are struggling with right now, you know, nationwide, saying these are the risks. This is the level of concern, but doing it in a way, like they've said in the chat, without instilling a fight, flight, or freeze response. But I just want to put a pin in that and say, we can talk about that in the Q&A. Right now, I will go into the don'ts. A lot of it is a slightly different bent on what Rachel covered in the do's, but just really want to drive home a few of these pieces from the harm mitigation point of view. So in addition to setting positive norms and, you know, saying this is who we are, building unifying identities that can really bolster community strength to better face these risks, there are a few pieces of you know, best practices that can really diffuse messages unintentionally causing harm. So the first of these is to avoid being vague or dishonest. I think this, you can think about the sort of importance of trust, you know, the importance of building trust. And it can be really tempting in these high pressure, tense moments to want to have all the answers and to want to give people what they're asking for and what they're needing for, or what they're needing. But in answering questions you don't really have the answers to, in sharing knowledge that you don't really have, you're really risking a lot. Not only are you being dishonest, but you're also really putting trust on the line. And that trust can be really hard to regain once you lose it. So be honest about what your capacity is, you know, where you're able to show up, what you're able to do, and then stick to it. Be specific about what your commitments are. Be honest about what you don't know or what you're not able to do, and stay rooted in your values. I'm on a call with, you know, a bunch of faith leaders. I don't think I need to go on a diatribe about integrity. I think that's pretty, you know, it seems like a pretty common core value for the folks on this call, but it's just really important to be specific and be honest about what you know, what you don't know, what you're able to do, and how you're able to help and mobilize. So next is not to speak about violence without also addressing the larger context and its short and long-term impacts. This again means talking about, you know, instances of violence outside of the idea that it's happening in a vacuum, right? So looking at Kyle Rittenhouse, for example, rather than saying, you know, rather than discussing just a lone wolf attack, this could be an opportunity to talk about the, you know, mobilization of white supremacist groups, the larger context of, you know, attacks on Black communities while organizing communities of color. And again, that's not to fuel collective blame, but to show people the larger context within which violence is happening. And the same is true for the inverse. So say, you know, if a couple of protesters, turn to violence at a protest, being sure not to speak about that without also speaking to the larger context of, what people are protesting, the history of the area, the history of, say, race relations in an area. Third is not to dehumanize. And Rachel spoke about this pretty extensively. So dehumanizing language is one of the core components of language that really drives people toward mobilizing for violence. If you remove someone's humanity, if you remove the idea that someone is a human being just like you, the moral obligations of how you interact with them shift, right? Because you would treat, say, a cockroach or a rat or a dog differently than you would a fellow human being, or at least the norms around how you would engage are very different. The moral norms around how you would engage are very different. And as Rachel said, sometimes, we see this really obvious dehumanizing language coming from, say, white supremacist groups. We've seen this throughout history, preceding genocides, mass atrocities, political violence. Dehumanization can also happen in more subtle ways, or by people who maybe have, good intentions, but end up really reiterating these dehumanizing frames. Again, that can be, portraying targeted groups as lacking agency, focusing only on, pain and suffering without the more complex emotions, full stories as full human beings. So not only is it important to push back against dehumanizing language in its really obvious forms, but also to avoid dehumanizing language, images when calling out violence as well. Next is to not signal negative norms. Again, Rachel really spoke about this, which is how to call something out without raising its profile or normalizing it. And again, that doesn't mean a Pollyanna positivity approach of everything's great in our town, on the following, an attack by white nationalists. What it means is calling out, the violence, the mobilization for violence, the negative dynamics, but doing so in a way that won't make people afraid to speak out by going against the larger group, won't silence people, won't make people feel like that is what the majority of people are doing or want to do, because that is a really powerful driver of behavior. So an example of this could be, rather than saying hate is everywhere, hate is on the rise. Our town has never seen more hate groups than we have right now. You could reframe that in a way that says, as hate groups are increasing, or in light of the increase of hate groups or mobilizing of hate groups, a growing movement of citizens, residents of our town are pushing back, or an overwhelming number of voices are speaking out against this. So you can really call attention to these negative dynamics without signaling a negative norm. Next is to really avoid feeding narratives of collective blame. Again, this is the idea that we see really peddled a lot before, preceding political violence, preceding genocide, mass atrocities, widespread group targeted harm. It's this idea that somehow they're all the same, and they're all guilty. of something. They are all guilty for a wrong against our group. They are all, you know, a threat to our group. And this is really dangerous. We have seen, obviously, how this has played out in the US in a number of ways with different marginalized groups, you know, being scapegoated and really targeted using this type of justification. So when looking at violent incidents, looking at mobilization for violence, looking at, you know, scapegoating, we really want to be as specific as possible, calling out the dynamics. So saying, you know, being specific about who committed violence, who's mobilizing toward violence, who is spreading dangerous messages, and being careful about the different power dynamics involved and how you know, collective blame or narratives of collective blame can interact with existing power dynamics and stereotypes to really become, you know, a dangerous driver of these dynamics. Again, don't raise the profile or notoriety of violent actors. This can fuel intimidation. So again, going into the reporting on militias, right? So how many people now, you know, after, say, an attack by a white nationalist group, how many times have we seen the media talk about 4chan, 8chan, talk about the, you know, the different manifestos that they're reading, and really bring notoriety and attention to white nationalist groups following violence done on their behalf or done by them. Instead, keep the focus on community response, again, like Rachel said. So we can call out negative behaviors, we can call out violence, we can call out, you know, negative actors, but really, again, what do you want the attention on ultimately? What do you want to have the platform? You want the platform on responses and prevention and, you know, people who are working to protect their own communities and support other communities. Finally, don't repeat misinformation or rumors. This includes unfounded claims. Again, this goes back to what Rachel said about not repeating misinformation. And if you are repeating misinformation, to put a warning before it. Again, this is the best practice is to instead introduce something, you know, introduce a competing piece of information. So instead of saying, you know, Dan's not a thief, saying Dan is honest, Dan is trustworthy, you know, and I trust Dan with everything I own. Next would be don't emphasize or create confusion and chaos. So again, avoiding sensationalist or alarmist language. This metaphors are really powerful primers for our brain. The way we understand the world around us is largely done through metaphors. We have seen with COVID, for instance, a lot of use of war metaphors. So, you know, we are at war against the virus. The virus is the enemy. We've also seen a lot of metaphors that really tie COVID to criminality. So, you know, COVID is lurking, COVID is stealing from us. And those, we've seen with COVID that those metaphors really run the risk of creating an us versus them mentality that can then be transferred to people who are, you know, who have the disease or are seen as being at risk for the disease or who are otherwise associated with the disease. The same is true in all contentious topics or all high pressure topics. Be really mindful about the metaphors you're using, the frames you're setting. What are the associations you're creating in people's minds? Finally, don't buy into a zero-sum frame. Again, this is, we see a lot of us versus them messaging. That's really at the core of mobilizing around conflict. So, and the idea that if they win, we lose, and vice versa. There's no middle ground. There's no winning unless they lose completely. And sometimes a lot of messaging can really reinforce that. So instead of buying into or speaking within the zero-sum framework of us versus them, instead emphasize common goals and potential for cooperation across different groups. Reframe what it means to win. Reframe what the goals are in the end. And can you frame cooperation as a goal? Can you frame a common future as a goal? Rather than keeping this us versus them frame intact, even if you're trying to spread positive messages within it, can you widen the frame generally? So this is our primer on messaging. Obviously, as I said earlier, this is one piece of the puzzle. We all, I think, especially in the age of social media, are looking for the kind of proverbial silver bullet for messages. And what we know really matters is we have these best practices. We know what can backfire, but what really matters is, all the other pieces as well. So who is your audience? What are their values? Who is the speaker? What channels are you reaching people with? What infrastructure do you have to reach people? And by infrastructure, I mean, is it a Facebook group? Is it a phone tree? Is it a weekly Zoom? So while these tips for messages are important, there's also so much more that's important for getting these messages out and really mobilizing people to build an active peace in their communities.
So, stop sharing. We'll turn it over to the Faith and Public Life team for question and answer. I see there's a lot of comments to respond to, but I just want to really emphasize Sam's last point, which is that all of these messages are meant to drive action. How are you driving people to show up outside the mosque? How are you driving people to open their doors to provide sanctuary for someone, or to show up in support of something or use their voice? And so really connecting it to the action is what we'll get to at the next time of how do you have that infrastructure to mobilize and connect messaging to action and set frames now that will enable you to mobilize and use these messages to tap into them in real time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. My name is Kelsey Herbert, and I'm with Faith in Public Life. I want to give a round of applause to Dan, Rachel, and Sam for that really informational training. And it doesn't stop here. The messaging training is the first part. And we know so many of you are so active on the ground, and so we're really excited to dig into building resilient communities together and hear about the resilient communities that you're building already. So we have a lot of questions. Feel free to keep putting them in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll get to them. We have about 15 minutes. This is awesome. So a question that came early on is this question of when we're modeling positive behavior, how do we model empathy without sounding like we're bragging? There's, we are, people of faith. We're people of humility. How do we balance those two things? Particularly since someone's curious about on social media. So there's a fine line between being a role model and developing a cult of personality. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's about, are you just talking about yourself, or are you recognizing your role to also be able to elevate other people? So So showing something you did, or, you know, if you're in a position where you're able to provide someone positive recognition, and that's going to incentivize other people to want that positive recognition, or you're able to provide somebody else a platform to say, I'm sharing this story. I was so inspired to read this by someone else. So knowing that you are in many ways a role model, you don't have to brag. You can share stories. You can be very authentic about it. Wow, I had this experience and I just want to share it. Has anybody else had a similar experience? Or I heard this story the other day and it really inspired me, and this is what it connected to for me. So I think finding ways to stay authentic to yourself, but also recognize that leaders do play a really big role in signaling to people what's possible for them, what they can do, what's expected of them. And then I think using your platform to tell stories from other people and provide recognition for that as well, and ask people to sharing something from yourself and saying, like, has anybody else had a similar experience that you can share, right? That starts to get more engagement, that builds that peer-to-peer support. And it also shows, I don't think I'm the only one who's doing this, but this was my experience. That's my first.
Yeah, one of those questions was specifically around social media, and like, I follow hundreds and hundreds of pastors on Twitter, and I just want to add an example of something that I've seen work really well, which is, I think what Rachel is talking about here is kind of like passing the microphone. If you can share stories from your own congregation without, naming first and last names necessarily, there's confidentiality, but you're more so than just like talking about how you feel, sharing the stories of like the people who are within your own congregation or people who come up to you with their stories is, to me, really effective. And I've seen a lot of pastors call other people into empathy by just sharing very empathizable stories and just saying like, this really grabbed me too. So I think you could do it without centering yourself. And the fact that you even have that question in your mind of, am I building a cult of personality, is a good signal that your ego is in check.
Thanks, everybody. I think in the chat box, many of us are wrestling with the idea of pacifism as a privilege and a luxury, and people's ideas are shifting based on what we're witnessing in Portland. So I wonder if someone could speak to how this messaging that we're talking to is not passive, and how it's proactive, and share more about how it is proactive and what it looks like when it's successful, or reassure us that this isn't, passive work, that this is proactive work that we can do, and it does make a difference.
I'm happy to start if you want, Sam. I think there's a couple of things, and I think part of what makes this conversation challenging is that we're at a moment where we're seeing so many different types of violence, right? We're anticipating so many types of violence. For example, in the wake of the elections, might there be people really mobilizing around results, and might there be different groups of protesters that clash with each other? That's really different than a militia group showing up to intimidate people at the polls in terms of exactly what you're managing. And it's different than state security forces, whether it's police or federal, showing up and targeting protesters. So I think there's a few. First of all, let me start with the question about being passive. I think that the point here is to be active and proactive and set an agenda and be able to mobilize people in the face of risk. It is not to say, hands up, we can't do anything about this situation, but it's to show up in ways that are effective. I keep going back to this example of the way that Dan and Horsed mobilized at the mosque, but that was effective because people showed up and said, we're not gonna allow this type of violence here, right? We're not gonna let this happen. And I think what we see with police use of force against protesters, for example, is the importance of in terms of that norm setting, right? Having more and more messengers that say, we won't accept this type of violence. We absolutely don't find this to be acceptable. This is what we expect instead to be the actions of security forces that are paid with taxpayer dollars, right? Because I see some questions about that too. So it's not about being passive. It's actually about being very forceful and very proactive and showing up. And it's about doing so in a really strategic way. And I think that's the point of all of this, is like these are some of the things we know that matter for being able to prevent the type of targeted hate violence that we've seen, for being able to prevent the type of abuse of power by different security forces. I think it's really showing up and saying, we don't accept this. This is who we are. This is what we expect. And actually being able to mobilize people to stand up for that in different ways. Whether, again, it's by, I think we saw this week an example of a church opening itself as sanctuary, whether it's people showing up. We saw the Wall of Moms. We've seen lots of different ways that people have shown up, not themselves mobilized for violence, but getting very engaged in these very strategic ways that say, this is, I mean, if you think about the Wall of Moms messaging, it says, we're moms, therefore we care about this, therefore we're showing up and we're forming a wall because that's how much this matters for us.
Super. And thinking about these messages, where are effective places to promote these messages? So like showing up, and you were saying it's more than words. It is showing up, and what are we doing when we do show up? It's the way we position our bodies. It's what we're saying. It's what we're singing there. But where are other places? I mean, many people here perhaps are in a position where they can preach or teach to a faith community. What are some other places, like even media, where people can promote these messages?
Mm-hmm. So that's a really good question. And I think the answer is, again, not necessarily a silver bullet one. It is figure out who your audience is and message where they will find it. So reach your audience through the channels that matter to them. If your audience is, say on Facebook, if they all go to the same community center, if they all watch the same news network, if they are all part of an email chain or a listserv, go to where your audience is and really tailor your strategy to who you're trying to reach. I would add again, as a note about social media, that I think a lot of people get sort of laser focus on social media as where these dynamics play out. Social media certainly makes these messages spread faster and farther than ever before, but that doesn't mean that it is the only sort of medium or the only sort of channel that should be considered. And people shouldn't underestimate the power of face-to-face conversations, or right now Zoom to Zoom conversations, text messages, other mediums that really will reach people at different points of their days and really speak to them in different ways.
I would add to that too, that because I saw somebody talk about relationships with the media, I think another thing about faith leaders that's important is a level of influence with people like city governments, right? Mayors, local mayors, with the ability to call the media. I think people who are leaders in different faith communities, the ability to call up the phone and try and get through to these different stakeholders to push these norms as well. We talked a lot about public messaging, but in the toolkit we talk about some other options. So there's mobilizing people to action, having this narrative framework that you're mobilizing people to say, actually the majority of us or people of faith are going to show up in this way, and you're using this to mobilize a rapid response. But there is also the use of influence. So calling legislators, calling local government officials or the media and talking to them about how they report, or saying, hey, by the way, we saw that you reported that there was violence everywhere in our city, and we think that it's important to talk about the way that this militia group showed up, or we want to tell you that actually we saw this many peaceful protesters showing up for the last 4 days, and by the way, also this is what the faith community has been doing that's positive, and we'd like to see a little bit more responsible reporting about the overall context here. Mm-hmm. So I think, and from political leaders, we want to see you condemning this particular act, or we want to see you telling the police force not to use rubber bullets on the backs of protesters, or whatever it might be. I think using that influence can be important too.
Thank you. Some more trends I'm seeing in the chat. I think you really touched on many of these, and there's just a lot of information. So if you could just hit home, the moment we're in, everyone feels like this is the most urgent thing ever, and it feels like the most urgent thing ever. It is the most urgent thing ever. But communicating fear and can make people feel like they can't do anything. So anything more on how to message urgency without instilling fear, and any like really practical examples of that?
Absolutely. Rachel, I can start, and then if you want to add.
Yeah,
great. So I think in this moment it is very scary. And the way we have been talking about risk in this country is that the lot of indicators for risk and a lot of precipitating risk factors in this year have really caused the sort of strength or the fortifications against violence to deteriorate very quickly. But in the grand scheme of things, the U.S. Is still according to international indicators and risk indicators, the U.S. is still a relatively healthy society. So the way that I have been thinking about that or looking at it is in the last few days specifically has been, imagine if someone is, suddenly has their health deteriorate, but they're still relatively healthy. We want to intervene as quickly as possible before they're really in bad shape. So this deterioration doesn't necessarily mean we should give up hope. What it means is that now is the time to really take proactive action to prevent further deterioration. And I think really emphasizing agency and saying, these risks are higher, but further deterioration, political violence are by no means inevitable. These are not inevitabilities. Increased risk does not mean inevitability. And, leaders across the country, whether they be faith leaders or leaders in elected positions, informal leaders, can really take action now and lay the groundwork now to fortify their own communities from violence, from these dynamics playing out further.
I would just add, and address the existing ways that these dynamics are playing out. We, of course, do see a level of political violence. We've seen such a rise in hate crimes over the past few years. And I think that as more people feel a moment of urgency, it's a moment to build some will around this in the long term. I also want to say there's not a problem in communicating urgency. Where it gets problematic is where you start to make people feel overwhelmed and like there's nothing I can do. So saying, and it could go wrong this way and this way and this way, and sort of overwhelming people with all the scenario planning you might be doing to be prepared can really flood people and make them feel like there's nothing I can do. I think it's communicating to say, there is a sense of urgency. Look at what we're feeling and seeing already in our community and what we've seen already happen. Look at, you can point to the fact that there is some level of risk without saying, and therefore this worst case scenario or that worst case scenario is going to happen. But this is where it comes to marrying that with a positive frame that leads people to action. This is such an intense moment of urgency because we see these risks present, and this is what we're doing about it. Therefore, as a faith community or as faith leaders, we're called to take action, and we don't want to wait another minute. We're going to start now making relationships with our neighbors, building our network. We're going to start thinking through what could we do in a range of scenarios, but we're also not going to wait. We're going to start putting messaging out now that affirms before the next bad thing happens or before something happens directly in our community that says, this is what we're striving towards. This is who we want to be as a community, and here's the actions we're taking today. We're so committed, if we're worried about voter intimidation in your community, we're so committed to make sure that everyone in our community feels safe voting that we've mobilized X hundred of faith leaders to be able to show up and just smile at people at polling stations through our masks, as I saw somebody say, with the signs that say, we're so happy our community is voting, thank you for participating together, or whatever that might be. Or we're gonna start messaging about core common values as communities of faith that we have. So I think it's about just not stopping at that urgency and not giving that overwhelm and overload, but really portraying this is a critical moment. And what that means is that this is how we have to act, and we have to do it now. And this is what we're going to do. This is how we all feel this urgency and this call to action.
Excellent. I think that we can just copy and paste that into sermon notes, your next op-ed. I want to thank you all so much. I want to give Dan Neifelt the last word. I'm putting into the chat right now, our call to action is to register for this next webinar on October 7th at 3 p.m. to 4:30 Eastern Time. We're going to be talking about building resilient communities. And more info to come in the follow-up email with this recording and all the resources from Over Zero. And Dan, take it away, and then we will be done.
I just wanted to close one by saying thanks so much to Samantha and Rachel and to everyone who came today and hung on with us for so long. That is a real show of commitment. And I just wanted to reemphasize one thing that Rachel and Samantha said a lot. That word agency just came up over and over again. You know, focusing on what you can do and what you will do and communicating about that to the greatest extent possible. There's a million things that are huge that we can't control that we're trying to fight against. But if we just focus on what we are for and what we can do, and we just focus on that, rather than calling attention to the negative messages that everyone in your congregation is getting anyway, will help motivate rather than demotivate them. And on behalf of Faith in Public Life, again, thank you, and Over Zero, thank you so much. October 7th, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, bring 3 friends. The registration link will be in the follow-up email. And thanks again. Bye.